right. Well, I think we're ready to begin our second session of the morning. We'll start with Michelle Dillon, who'll be addressing the doctrinal belief and discernment among American Catholics in the 21st century. And then Dr. Cahill will provide a response to what we've heard this morning, and then we'll carry on with your questions and comments that the panelists would be glad to respond to. So I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Well, thank you all again for coming this morning. Thank you, Greg. I know somebody's timing me, so I won't be looking at my watch. But I'm going to talk largely about issues of Catholic identity among U.S. Catholics. And I just want to begin by saying that when we talk about American Catholicism, it is somewhat different from Catholicism elsewhere across the world, which sort of is an obvious point to make, but sometimes we forget that. And I just want to say that in particular, American culture, particularly because of the Protestant culture historically in America and the emphasis on individualism, we find that there is quite a lot of autonomy in general among Americans, whether Catholic or Protestant, in how they practice religion. Religion has long been a source of cultural and subcultural identity for all Americans. And this is very different from the European situation where, for example, even somewhere like Ireland, which has been historically a strong Catholic country, today is seeing a mass exit of Catholics who don't know how to deal with the crisis within Catholicism. So it's somewhat different, it's quite different from the American story of religion in general. Secondly, I would say related to that is, of course, that while, as Bill's presentation this morning emphasized, pre-Vatican II Catholicism, even in America, was very much within the one true church style of Catholicism, particularly with the impact of Vatican II and the emphasis on the democratization, if you like, of Catholicism. The church is the people of God. There has been a very significant increase over the last 40 years, 50 years in American Catholic identity. And we see this particularly impacted by Vatican II. And one of my favorite quotes from the many, many great quotes from Vatican II is about interpretive freedom, when the Second Vatican Council affirmed that no one is allowed to appropriate the Church's authority for his opinion or her opinion. All the faithful possess a lawful freedom of inquiry, and they have the freedom to express their minds and to do so in a competent fashion. And so I think this notion of interpretive autonomy, interpretive authority, makes a lot of sense in how we think about American Catholicism today. It has been very much part of the fabric of American Catholicism. And so when we look at this, and by the way, all of these slides are contained somewhere in your NCR essays, so you don't have to exhaust yourself taking down notes. And also, you don't need to know every statistic. The color is supposed to at least give sort of an indication of the sort of the larger trend, even though we can talk specifically about some of the components of that. When you look at this figure, you see that Catholics are highly differentiating about the various aspects of Catholicism that are very important to them. Many times we hear about cafeteria Catholics, sometimes it's used in a pejorative sense, as if Catholics really do just pick and choose whatever they feel like on the day. But in fact, our survey, in line with earlier surveys, shows that there is a pattern to that in terms of the fact that the core creedal beliefs and the core historical, if you like, early pieces of Catholicism matter a lot more to Catholics than some of the issues of social teaching, for example, or sexual teaching and moral authority. What we see in figure 1 is, for example, the 73%, so 3/4 of Catholics and 2/3, say that the resurrection is very important to them. That's probably good news, because we would think it should be. And Mary, the Blessed Virgin of Mary, and the sacraments. So these are sort of the core pieces, and this fits with other data that we have from Catholics about the importance of the liturgical tradition and the sacraments in general. Notably, though, too, helping the poor is up there as a core belief, basically, with 67% saying that helping the poor is a very important part of Catholicism for them. But if you then just quickly look to some of the bars on the right-hand side, you see that issues with regard to Vatican authority and the Church's teaching authority are seen as less important. For example, 35% of current Catholics say that the Church's opposition to same-sex marriage, for example, is only very important to them. So for most Catholics, this is not an issue of importance to them. Similarly, Vatican authority itself, less than a third of Catholics see that as a very important part of Catholicism to them. And indeed, celibacy, even though the Church obviously has a long tradition of having a celibate male clergy, and as we heard this morning from the earlier presentations, the issue of the shortage of priests raises all kinds of possibilities and new options. Indeed, it seems if only 21% of Catholics today see celibacy as a very important part of the tradition. So you get a sense from that figure that Catholics do discern between what we might call the more creedal or theological aspects of the tradition and the sort of the aspects of church authority in general, even though there's variation depending on the particular item you might ask about. Secondly, this is sort of made famous by Bill's series of studies, what can a good Catholic do? And we know indeed that good Catholics can do an awful lot of things of their own choosing. Again, you see that less than a third, 31%, say that a good Catholic can not adhere to church teaching on the resurrection and still be a good Catholic. So again, you get this sense of the flexibility, if you want to use that word, in how Catholics interpret and define the faith. But again, the pattern is that church teaching on the core aspects of theology have to be more adhered to than aspects got to do with church teaching, for example, on divorce and remarriage and having your own marriage approved by the church. On birth control, birth control was the first big item going back to after Humanae Vitae, where Catholics decided that they can be a good Catholic, go to Mass, and not adhere to church teaching on birth control. That was, if you look historically at the 20th century, that was the one issue that really, I think, following in the wake of Vatican II, not just I think, others think this, in the wake of Vatican II, really caused a split within American Catholicism between what an individual Catholic can do in good conscience and to the extent to which they can selectively accept and reject the teaching authority of the hierarchy. And so birth control has been the big issue, but increasingly today we see it also with issues got to do with abortion, with same-sex relations, with divorce without an annulment, and remarriage without an annulment. Nonetheless, despite this high level of autonomy among American Catholics, they are at the same time highly attached to the church. And this really is in a sense, the nutshell of what it means to be an American Catholic is that you have a high degree of personal autonomy in deciding for yourself what you think with regard to church teaching, but you mix this with a high degree of commitment. 88% say that they are unlikely to leave the Catholic Church. We know, of course, that many Catholics do leave the Catholic Church, and the Pew Forum and others have tracked this. Nonetheless, a lot of Catholics stay, and they stay and want to stay. The church, for many, is among the most important parts of their life. It's important for them that being a Catholic is a core part of their identity. They want younger generations of their family to grow up Catholic. And it's hard for them, at least for 2/3 of people, to imagine themselves as something other than Catholic. So this is sort of the complexity of American Catholicism, a high degree of personal autonomy and very high level of selectivity towards church teaching authority in particular, but that's blended in on a day-to-day basis with a deep level of commitment to Catholicism as a tradition. We see more evidence of this in a question that we asked for the first time this year about what are the aspects of Catholicism that are meaningful to you. And this was basically a lot of the questions on this were derived from other qualitative studies that we have of studies with Catholics and what it is that makes sense to them about why they want to stay Catholic. And again, you don't have to look at every detail, but you see, for example, concern for the poor, the sacraments, the Mass. All of those things are important, as we would expect from the earlier slides. But additionally, the second bar on the left, what we summarized as dissent and loyalty, and that basically was a response to the statement that you can, what I like about being Catholic, what's meaningful to me about Catholicism is that you can disagree with the church hierarchy and still remain a loyal Catholic. And this, as you see, 50% say that this is very meaningful, and an additional 36% say it's somewhat meaningful. So 86% of Catholics are able, in a sense, to stay within the church because to them being Catholic means disagreeing but being loyal and faithful to the tradition. And then, as you see further down, the issue of the unbroken tradition. Tradition matters to Catholics. They're selective about that tradition, but the fact that the church has an unbroken tradition back to the apostles, that's a very meaningful part, or a meaningful part for many Catholics. As is concern for the unborn. So even though many Catholics disagree with church teaching on abortion, for example, and on life, at the same time, it's for a lot of people a very meaningful part of the tradition. But again, we see that the least endorsed, very meaningful or meaningful aspect is the papacy. So again, it's this, we want the universal tradition, we want the continuity with the long papacy, if you like, and yet at the same time, the teaching authority of the Vatican and of the papacy is really not very important for most Catholics. We do see some gender differences. We could have probably a whole symposium on gender in Catholicism, but in this slide, I just want to, and I highlight among non-Hispanics, because as we heard from the earlier presentations, a lot of the Hispanics in our sample are younger, and younger people tend to be a little different than the rest of us. So this just looks at non-Hispanic Catholics in the sample. And you see here that really women who are green and men are purple, women are more religious. We know this from other studies, regardless of religion, but they're more likely than men to emphasize the personal importance of the resurrection, the personal importance of helping the poor, of Mary, the sacraments, prayer. And the last two items are on issues of moral authority. Women are more critical, if you like, of church hierarchical authority on certain core issues, notably opposition to same-sex marriage and to Vatican authority in general. And I interpret this finding in light of the findings on contraception, for example. Women, it's not that I think women are genetically disposed to be more religious than men, although neuroscientific findings might certainly prove that soon, but I think women are involved, as we know, in the day-in, day-out realities, the messy realities of life, have to juggle a lot of competing demands on their time, work and family, a lot of the issues within family. And of course, with the issues of sexuality, they're the ones who often most likely have to take the burden or take the responsibility for sexuality issues and decisions. And so I think the long-standing autonomy of Catholics in general towards sexuality and towards birth control extends, we see certainly among women, towards the issue of same-sex relationships and same-sex marriage, that women are more tolerant, if you like, they're more understanding of the practical challenges that same-sex couples have to deal with and of their own ability to use their consciences to make up their mind about their behavior. That's how I interpret that. So women are a little more liberal, if you want to use that term, than men with regard to church authority, but are more devotional, more devout, more sacramentally oriented than men when it comes to the core issues of Catholic creed, theology, and tradition. And the second, related to this and following our earlier figures, we see that women are far more likely than men. 57% of women compared to 46% of men are likely to say that what's very meaningful, this is not just meaningful, very meaningful to me about Catholicism is that I can disagree with the church hierarchy and still remain loyal. So this really is a highly gendered way of being Catholic, that the women really see this, and again, I think for the reasons I've just outlined in terms of their own position within the church. They also mentioned the Mass, fitting again with their greater involvement in the sacraments, that's very meaningful, and the sacraments in general, as well as concern for the poor. So over the years, the studies have looked at Catholics' commitment to the church, and we continue to do that. Again, I'd like to just put that in a little bit of context. In the last 25 years or so, there have been tremendous changes in general in American society. We've the changing demography, not just of changing immigration patterns, but we know that the 20-something generation are putting off marriage, postponing marriage. Many are cohabiting. There have been a lot of changes with regard culturally and legally in the whole area of same-sex relationships. So there's been a lot of social and demographic change happening within the country. Secondly, one of the biggest changes, and change happens somewhat slowly, but in religion, one of the biggest changes since the 1980s has been over a doubling in the percentage of Americans who claim no religious affiliation. Since polling started in the 1940s, about 7% of Americans typically said they had no religious affiliation. By the mid-90s, this had increased to about 14%, and it's currently at 18%. So this has really been a huge shift in American religious landscape, not just, obviously it's not Catholic, something in general in America. So increasingly, more and more Americans are saying they have no religious affiliation. Now, that leads to the next bullet there, which is that even though they don't have a religious affiliation, that does not mean that they have lost their belief in God or in spirituality or in some of the core issues that we would think of, such as belief in the afterlife. As the Pew Forum has well documented and other studies, there has been a tremendous increase in spiritual engagement outside of traditional church boundaries. So what we often refer to as sort of spiritual but not religious, and that's something I'll be returning to in my presentation this afternoon. And then, of course, within the church, not only have we had a new pope, which Bill has already alluded to, but also, as he also mentioned, the continuing issue and continuing fallout from the sex abuse scandal. So there's been a lot of change over the last 25 or 30 years, and it's followed by a blank because my next slide didn't translate, but what it would have said is that there has been a shift in American Catholics' commitment. And in 1987, 57% of American Catholics, we consider them to be moderately committed to the church, whereas today 64% are. So the majority of Catholics are moderately committed. So moderation is the Catholic way. High commitment in 1987, 27% of American Catholics we classified as a high commitment, but by today it's 19%. So there has been a shift, clearly a decline from those who are highly committed, slight increase in those who are moderately committed, but the people who are low committed has remained the same. So it's really that the people who were more highly committed have shifted to more moderate. But let's look at the indicators that we use to measure church commitment. Basically, we have three indicators: weekly Mass attendance, and as Bill showed you this morning, there has been a decline among Catholics in weekly Mass attendance. Second, church among the most important parts of my life, and I am unlikely to leave the Catholic Church. People had to anchor themselves on the very extreme edges of those. Say, I really am not going to ever leave the church. So this is a very high threshold index that we use of commitment. And I think when we look at that and see the slight move away, and I'm going to show you other slides on that, a slight move away from those who have been more highly committed to now being more moderately committed, it's in many respects explained by some of these larger dynamics, in particular the shift, the decline from weekly church attendance to now more monthly. As I've said elsewhere, monthly Mass has become the new weekly Mass. When you look at this, the demography of who's highly committed, so it's basically 19%, 20% of American Catholics are ranked as highly committed. There are no gender differences when you just look now at 2011 data. There are no gender differences, no significant region differences, no basically in terms of education as a whole. This is not Catholic education that Mary talked about. This is just level of education in general. And none by ethnicity. Hispanics and non-Hispanics are equally committed based on that index. There are differences, marital status. Those who are married are more likely than others to be highly committed, and this fits with other data that we would have, that marriage in general tends to have a more conservative force in social life. And the older age, the pre-Vatican II and older Catholics are more highly committed than younger. But for the most part, these trends don't have big demographic patterns. Now, not only are these are the highly committed, these are the 19-20% who go to Mass every week and who are highly, highly unlikely to leave the church, for example. Even these highly committed Catholics maintain the pattern of autonomy that I've alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. And you see, for example, that 48% of highly committed Catholics think that you can be a good Catholic without adhering to church teaching and weekly Mass. Right? So even though they themselves are strong or tend to be weekly Mass goers, they recognize that maybe you can be a good Catholic without doing that. And similarly, all these other items, you can be a good Catholic. Almost 2/3 of highly committed Catholics today think that you can be a good Catholic without adhering to church teaching on birth control, almost half on divorce, 31% on abortion. The issue of the real presence, which is a complicated issue because there's a lot of variation in opinion on what exactly the real presence constitutes. Even several highly committed Catholics think that you can be a good Catholic without believing in the real presence. And then helping the poor and helping the parish, quite a large percentage. This is something that we've seen an increase in this survey, the number of Catholics, including highly committed Catholics, who believe that one can be a good Catholic without either helping the poor or indeed helping the parish. And so you don't have to strain your eyes, but this really, the blue are the 2005 data, 2011 are the current data for the highly committed Catholics. And what you can see, the first one is about disagreeing and still remain loyal to the church, well over 50% there. But you also see that there's been a slight increase in the number of highly committed Catholics who are saying that you don't have to accept, for example, Vatican teaching authority, and then more specifically, it's teaching on same-sex marriage and some other issues. So even among the highly committed Catholics, and of course these are snapshots of highly committed Catholics, so it's not the same people. The people we interviewed in 2011 are not the same people we interviewed in 2005. They just fall within that category. There has been a sort of an increase in the autonomy of highly committed Catholics. So this is a different way of showing the blank slide that you didn't see. That what I would argue is that overall we can see these patterns of commitment between 1987 and today as showing relative stability. The red line, the top line, are the medium commitment, the moderately committed, and you can see that that is the one, as I said, that has increased. So there's been an increase in people who are moderately committed. And the high commitments have gone down, but it's not a staggering decline. And then the low has been up and down and is relatively stable. So you can look at any graph and different people. I'm more of an optimistic kind of person, so I see this as relative stability. I'm sure some people can look at this and say, oh my goodness, there's been a drop in the high. And so there has been a slight drop, but at the same time, it's not accompanied by a huge increase in the low. So the low and the high are relatively similar, but it's really the moderately committed. As I said, being Catholic is a moderate commitment kind of way of being. So if you accept that this is relative stability, it might be good news or bad news depending on your attitude, but I do think that it sort of veils certain other shifts behind the data. So even though I said that it's true, in 2011 there are no gender differences among the highly committed, when you actually look back over the data and look, because historically and currently today, as I said, women, I would argue, are the bridge to the living Catholicism, to the maintenance of Catholicism as a living tradition. They value the sacraments more, they value aspects of Catholic tradition more. More women than men attend Mass at least monthly, so they're, in whatever set of indicators we take, they're more involved in the life of the church. And I would also point out that one of the important reasons why people go to Mass is that they want to please someone who's close to them. And we find that there's a gender difference on that. Men are more likely to go to Mass because they want to please somebody, either their wives or their mothers, presumably. Whereas women tend to have more of the reasons that Bill alluded to this morning about valuing the liturgy. So women, in this sense, to me, really are this bridge. They're more involved themselves in the church and in its tradition and in its sacraments, but they're also, if women stop going to Mass, probably a lot of men are going to be staying at home too. That's a prediction, a hypothesis that would be tested. But I do want to say that when we look, as I said, at the gender there's no gender difference right now in commitment, but we can't assume that that's going to continue. If you look at this graph, these are gender patterns in weekly Mass attendance since 1987 to our current survey. And there, whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, I think you have to let the lines speak for themselves. Women, the green line, have clearly had a precipitous decline in the 25 years of the survey. That's gender patterns, weekly Mass and weekly Mass. There's been a big gender decline with women saying that the Catholic Church is among the most important parts of my life. We see that's gone down from close to 60%, that's among the most important parts, not just an important part, to now being around 40% and less than 40%, and in fact being lower than men, right? So these are showing decline in women's commitment in this sense. And thirdly, I would never leave the Catholic Church. Interesting graphs where you see this increase between 1987 and 1993 for men and women, even though women are, again, of course, the most committed. They're always the higher. They're the green line. But the drop, men have been relatively stable in their responses to that question, whereas women, again, quite a steep drop. So this, to me, is, interesting that, how long, just because, of course, I should say that just because a line goes down doesn't mean it can't come back up again, and we know that that often happens in various trends. So it's not to make predictions about the future, but nonetheless, in terms of a trend over time, this is clearly, so far, at least for the last 25 years, going in a very specific direction, and that direction is one of declining commitment, declining participation. We don't have time today to pursue why this may be the case, although I'm sure many of you could think of some ideas as to that. But maybe one has to do with women's roles within the church as we confront issues of the priest shortage and the various options. I know theologically, women priests is not currently an option. It's not an option among the options that Mary outlined for us this morning. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting, at least to bring to your attention, that men and women among our survey respondents today are basically in solid agreement, or no gender difference on this, as to supporting women's roles in the church. And as you can see, 90% think that women can be readers at Mass, so that's good. That they can be religious education directors, parish administrators, youth ministers, altar servers, close to 90, Eucharistic ministers, a little fewer, but nonetheless support for that. A deacon, 70%, and then for women and the role of priests, 60%. And that 60% is actually fairly consistent with surveys in the past and with other surveys. So there is majority support. I know we're not a democracy when it comes to Catholicism. And it's not a gender. It's not just that women are saying, oh, women should be Eucharistic ministers and women should be deacons and women should be priests. Women and men, at least in response to these questions, equally support roles for women in the church. And so that may be a possible point of conversation if we go back and look at the graphs showing women's decline, that maybe if we re-look at some of these options, is there a way of getting women more involved and making them feel more fully participating in the institutional life of the church in terms of issues of priesthood? So that's a possibility. So in conclusion, American Catholics are highly autonomous in their views of what it means to be Catholic, of what's important in Catholicism and what's meaningful to them. They are, at the same time, strongly attached to the church on several different indicators, as we saw. Women are more involved than men in the church's sacramental and its community and its church tradition. So they're just much more involved in the life of the church. Catholic commitment, as I said, has been moderate and stable for the last 25 years. Yet there has been a significant decline in women's commitment over time, such that today there is no gender difference. But the absence of a gender difference right now veils the long-term gender difference that we just saw. Thank you very much.